I mean, I had just one brief comment on that, but I would like to move on to what you've just said, because one of the questions that I had in mind was, how are we to deal with the divergences or a possibility of some incompatibilities, more than one, between these two thinkers? And now that you've broached this topic of Lacan's critical thoughts on what is such a crucial distinction, that's foundational for Heidegger, the ontological distinction. That sounds like we're getting to an area of some real substantive issues and potential disagreements. But just before we do that, I mean, I just wanted to throw in there, while we're thinking about ethics in the multiple and sometimes quite diverse senses of what an ethical position might be, I have this memory, and I'm not sure of it, I have to admit, because I've subsequently gone to try and find this again in the book where I thought I read it. But and you might know it, but if I remember correctly, Jacques Derrida makes this comment, and he says something like this. I hope it's not just a fantasized or imagined remark on my part. He says that in an odd sort of way, Heidegger's legacy presents us with an ethical dilemma. And the ethical dilemma is, I suppose you could say it's obvious. Well, here is this crucially important philosophical contribution to the 20th century. And here is Heidegger's own dubious political history. We could make the move of simply saying, we will repress Heidegger, we won't read him anymore, which seems a failure, because presumably the real ethical nature of the challenge ahead is a kind of Lacanian real. How do you deal with these two things, which seem to present us with a kind of incommensurability? We've got Heidegger, the man, or the image of Heidegger, that many people would like to reject because of that history, but you've got something that's so crucial and important. And I think, if I'm remembering, Derrida's answer is not that we find a solution to this, but that it's precisely the ethical dilemma, the ongoing ethical challenge of how to live with these two component facets. I'll just say one further thing. I mean, to me, that seems a useful, non-resolvable ethical dilemma. And maybe it's one that impacts on how we think the clinic, because presumably how we think the clinic and a position as an analyst in the clinic is that we're dealing or working with human subjects who, of course, will, in many instances, present us with material that is not material that can easily be necessarily, agreed with or we find morally edifying or something. Particularly working in certain forensic contexts, it may be material that is fundamentally disagreeable, but that doesn't erase one's ethical commitment to that subject's life, in a sense, or that subject. Anyway, sorry, that was a long spiel. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to go back to it or not. But let's now think two questions. Where do we find important compatibilities or overlaps or productive moments of interface, articulation between Heidegger and Lacan? And where do we start to find some differences? And maybe I'd love to come back to the ontological question, but maybe one way of doing that first is to say, what is Lacan's, could you qualify and clarify for us, what is Lacan's position towards ontology? Because if we have a little bit of an idea of that, then we might be able to get a sense of how they might be put together within the domain of the ontological. And I say that because in many respects, the ontological doesn't seem to be a priority for Lacan, to put it mildly.
Yeah. There's a problem with ontology. In the traditional ontology, there is a problem. It takes some assumptions for granted. Traditional philosophical ontology, for example, that the human being is an observer in the world and sees the world, and the world is there, and we have the intellect, let's say. This is in Western philosophy, to clarify that. It's not all around the world. But in Western philosophy, there is this always, after Descartes, this assumption that there is the intellect, the embodied intellect in the best case, that sees the world objectively and tries to speak about the world and understand the world. And how this is done is a question of epistemology. And what you think about is a question of ontology. So these are distinctions of traditional philosophy. Heidegger comes into this and he tries to say, oh, okay, that's a good starting point, but really I want to do a fundamental ontology. I want to speak about what it is really the question, where before the differentiation between the human being and the world. And this is his attempt at the fundamental ontology. And he abandons this research project, Heidegger, because he finds that this is not possible, and in fact it is doomed to failure. So he abandons the concept of ontology completely, Heidegger, and not even Lacan. Now, Lacan also comes from this traditional comments. He has a background in traditional philosophy. He knows that when we speak about ontology, we imply that, again, the intellect that sees the world and speaks about the world, speaks about being, and so on and so forth. And Heidegger and Lacan also is skeptical originally, and then critical of that it fails to address the issue how the world is constructed through the body. What is the world that is constructed through the body? What is it that we are talking about? What is this thing that we are talking about? And he, Lacan, finds the concepts lacking. The concept of ontology then becomes completely irrelevant for him as a research objective. So he rejects it. Heidegger rejects it as well. However, so in this case, then I answer your question. How can we conceptualize ontology in Lacan? He rejects it. And then we remind ourselves that Heidegger rejects it as well. And then we need to understand what is ontology in order to see if this term is useful, because I'm using this term after all. I'm using a term like ontology, even though I now publicly say that both these thinkers that I connect to as an ontology have rejected the term. So what am I doing here? I'm using the term ontology in a slightly more narrow sense of the actual term, that is logos over onta. Onta is beings. And logos means speaking about them, thinking about them, or seeing them together, gathering them, as Heidegger had it. So a collection of onta and what we can think about them. Incidentally, I have to say that interesting, you can see in computer science, people speak of ontology today, and they don't mean anything metaphysical, they don't mean anything philosophical, they mean exactly that, collections of items that this particular software or software environment or domain of software environments can speak about and deal with. So I'm using ontology in this sense. And in this sense, I think Lacan would not disagree, because when he speaks about the human being, and when he speaks about jouissance, when he speaks about all the concepts that he's using, they imply a field where these concepts have some kind of reference. And this reference is an ontology, this field of reference.
That's really helpful. And I think it also enables us to foreground one of the most important contributions that you make in Discourse Ontology, your book, is when you start to narrow down and specify 5 domains within, if we could call it that, 5 thematic areas within a discourse ontology. So maybe we should try to take some steps there, because I think that's really some of the most important areas that you cover, of the most important areas you cover in your book. But as the stepping stone to doing that, I suppose we should mention the notion of discourse. And this seems important to me just because, it's one of those words in the social sciences and in the humanities that seems to mean an awful lot of things to an awful lot of people. You have Foucault's notion of a discourse, which seems to, in many ways, take its name and get its identity via its kind of disciplinary application. In other words, it's often, not always, but largely to do with the contents that it refers to and how that's been bounded. So if we're going to say that we have a prospect here of some commonality, of some overlap between Heidegger and Lacan in respect to the conceptualization of discourse, we should say a few things. Why is the concept of discourse so important? Why is it so absolutely irreducible to a Lacanian project and indeed to a Heideggerian project? That'd be one question. And then what is there that the two thinkers have in common when they think about discourse? And what might some of the differences be?
I mean, as you said, the concept of discourse has many, many, many different understandings. Let's see now. I would not say that discourse is an important concept in Heidegger as such. Obviously, he speaks about discourse and he connects it with the chit chat that people are doing and whatever is happening in the world around you. And he differentiates, Heidegger differentiates that, distinguishes between that, which is the people, with all the bad connotations of the people, with the design, the human being, design, who is invited to think about what is the design's almost genuine, authentic, as it has been translated. For Lacan, discourse is something different. It is an indication of the social bond. He actually defines that as a social bond. And what is social bond? Is how people engage with each other. But there is something very crucial in Lacan, which is completely absent in Heidegger. The crucial thing in Lacan is the predominance, if we can say that, the predominance that he gives to the signifier. So for Lacan, the important thing in the psyche is not what we think, the meaning of what we think. I'm simplifying a bit now, but I'm trying to show some kind of distinction. It's not the meaning of what we think. The meaning is almost irrelevant. Is how the constitutive elements of our thinking are connected together, the signifiers. So the important thing is the signifiers and the interconnections and interrelationships of signifiers, jumps between signifiers, one brings the other and so on. That's the important thing for Lacan. This is the lesson he was taught by Freud, and this is his starting point. He says famously that the subject is what is represented by one signifier to another signifier. Now, this idea that signifiers are connected, and in the way they are connected, the subject is represented, is unique Lacanian. And I would now go and say that this is what the discourse is for Lacan. The discourse is the way the signifiers are connected into a signifying network for each and every speaking being. So discourse is two different things simultaneously. One is a measure or a description of the organization of the psyche, and the other is a measure and the description of the organization of many human beings engaging into communication. So the subject in the Lacanian understanding is a product of discourse. That is not the case in Heidegger. So that could be a complete disagreement. For Heidegger, the design finds themselves there. He or she is not a gendered entity, find themselves there, and they have to do something with that. And they have to see their authenticity, let's say. That's the moral aspect of Heidegger. For Lacan, the subject doesn't exist there and finds language to use. The subject is constructed through language, is constructed through discourse. So discourse is a necessary aspect of being in language and a necessary aspect of being a human being, speaking human being. And in my understanding, discourse is a necessary aspect of having an ontology. You cannot have an ontology. You cannot have a world if you are not in a discourse, if you are not product of a discourse. So you are a product in a discourse, and this means, by virtue of being a product of discourse, that you are in a world which is constructed by this discourse.
Right. That helps bring together a whole series of different ideas. I mean, maybe just to try to recapitulate and throw back at you some ideas there. I like very much the Lacanian understanding of a discourse, which entails, I think, as you very nicely put it, the idea that in many respects the subject is a function of the signifier. The subject is, in a sense, produced by the interaction of signifiers. It's a kind of counterintuitive idea in many respects, and it's one that you spend some time on describing in your book, but a very important one, and also one that we do not find in Heidegger. I mean, I suppose I still wanted to maybe try and suggest that there is some potential overlap of sorts. And just thinking back to early Lacan and notions of full speech and empty speech, and you'll have to forgive me if I get the conceptualization slightly wrong. Having made that point, this is a part of Lacan's understanding of discourse that doesn't exist within Heidegger. We also have the early Lacan's reference to, maybe more implicit than otherwise, the Rede-Gerede distinction in Heidegger, this distinction you were referring to, the idle chatter as opposed to a kind of discourse. And if I'm understanding it correctly, we do have in Heidegger still some kind of notion of a discourse, which means that we can separate certain types of communicative interaction. One, the idle chatter, the ongoing fatuous noise of everyday speech, which doesn't take us anywhere towards the truth of being. If anything, it takes us away from that, which you could say reconceptualized sounds a lot like Lacan's empty speech. Whereas you do still have in Heidegger this idea that there could be discourse which enables us to, or enables us to move towards a truth of being. In other words, there is some kind of function of discourse which is viable, which is enabling, and which has a relationship to truth of sorts. So I suppose what I'm kind of reaching for here is that that in different ways, both of these two intellectuals at some point have some faith in or belief in the prospect of a relationship between discourse and truth. Any thoughts you had on that?
I mean, the new concept that you added in this, what you say, which is very interesting, is the concept of truth. And I would think that the concept of truth, if you ask me in the hierarchy of concepts, let's say, what is more important, discourse in Heidegger or truth? I would say is truth. It's much more important. And it's important in many different ways, not only because truth has to speak about true things, not in this sense only, also in this, but not only in this sense. But truth being something, the Heideggerian approach to truth has something to do with revelation, something that the world is opened to you, and it is presented to you as something that you accept as such. And this is truth, is the ancient word aletheia, is what is given to you by the world which is opening to you. And how is the world open to you in Heidegger? It's actually through language. He says language is the house of being. So it is in language that the world is being presented to the human being. So you can even say that it is in discourse that the language, that the world is opening to the human being. And if we say it in this way, then there is a commonality with the discourse, the Lacanian discourse. But I would think that the crucial part here is truth. And why I say truth, why I insist on truth, because I find a very interesting connection with Lacan, where he goes into Freud, and he speaks about Freud's understanding of negation, where in Freud, negation is actually what is opening, is a description of how the world is being opened. Freud, brings the concept of bejahung, that you have to accept something as given in order to be able to have a judgment, whether this something is this or that. And we see Freud suddenly, even though Freud, he famously claims that he doesn't do at all philosophy, he is against philosophy, he is a scientist and he wants to think scientifically about questions. In this case, he goes in very deep philosophy because he makes a claim that is not about truth statements in terms of correspondence of a statement with a state of affairs. That is important for the human being. It is the first acceptance of the world as such, this bejahung that you see. And Freud speaks about that in negation. And then Lacan takes it, grasps it, and makes a whole point in the very early works in his first seminar. The main thing that Lacan recognizes in Freud and stresses is this bejahung, the acceptance, the revelation, which we cannot fail to see that is a Heideggerian idea. So Lacan says that Freud is Heideggerian there, without knowing it. And Heidegger has failed to see that Freud actually does not say very strange things. If you forget the mechanistic ideas and the mechanistic conclusions, Freud says important things. This is the criticism of Heidegger's understanding of Freud. So anyway, what I was trying to say is that, yes, discourse in this way is common in Heidegger and in some of Lacan. And if we put aside whatever it has to do with the noise and the chatter of the day, the discourse in Heidegger becomes a way to address the historicity of being, that being is not one thing, but comes within a history, or not within a history, it comes with periods. It's a different thing being today than it was in the ancient, the time of Aristoteles. This historicity of being can be described as a difference of a discourse. So we have a genealogy, let's say, of discourse that is happening and is visible in Heidegger, and it is important. But personally, I would put more stress on the concept of truth, but is compatible. The two ways are compatible. And this genealogy of discourse, this way that the human being, the eras of society, of engagement with the society, of questions, of desire, of everything, that this is historical, you find that also in Lacan. When Lacan says, to return to your previous point about the ethical aspect of the unconscious, we recognize that the unconscious is something that compels us to act. We can only recognize that after Descartes, because what Descartes is bringing is the belief that the human being, the subject, the intellect, can actually think for themselves and they can decide for themselves. That's the only thing they can do. They can doubt everything and they can do that. So they can question. So when you have a dream, before Descartes, you take it for granted that is coming any kind of explanation. Either it is a premonition of the future or something of that sort, or is a message from the gods. You do something, you don't take it as yours. After Descartes, it becomes a scientific problem. And I say the word scientific now with knowledge, because Lacan has Science and Truth, a paper in the Écrit, in which he makes this claim that the subject of psychoanalysis is the subject of science. And what he means is that after we have Descartes and the human being can see and conceptualize the world as something that can be thought about, it's only then that the unconscious becomes the unconscious that compels us to act.
Which is also to say that the unconscious has an ethical status, in a sense.
Yes, exactly. So all of these things fit together. The ethical status of the unconscious is not a statement that could be valid for Aristoteles. It's only valid after Descartes.
Yes, yes.
This is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, that's excellent.